My name is Gabryel Garcia-Sampson, and I grew up in El Paso, Texas, which is along the border with Juarez, Mexico, which is our sister city. It's always been a binational city, and so this was a topic that was especially close to my heart and something that I had spent a lot of time thinking about. And so today we're going to be talking a little bit about borders, kind of the ways in which it applies not only physically, but then also within healthcare, and then specifically to our community. So we're going to kind of break it up into three parts, and it's really meant to be a discussion. I'm by no means an expert on what a border is, and definitely there's probably people on this Zoom who have thought about this and know much more about this than I do. But I just wanted to create a little bit of space to talk about what is a border and whether or not we think they exist in healthcare, and if so, where are they? And then really kind of thinking about how this applies to the work that we're doing as a coalition. And then if we do think that it applies, what are the kind of strategies or ideas that we have for how we try to address it? And so why talk about this? For those who were able to come to the meeting a while back in January, was a little bit, I think it was the first meeting in January. We were talking a little bit about everything that was happening, and Viviana invited me to share a little bit about my experience. I had just come back from being home in December and had been texting with her about kind of everything that I was seeing. And one of the videos that I showed during that time kind of highlighted some of the changes that I had seen growing up to the border. And it started a conversation between us about how those differences and kind of the idea of what the border looks like kind of has changed over time. And for many people who've never really been to the border or have seen the US-Mexican border, there can be a lot of different ideas, and it's mostly really shaped by the media that we see. I'm mostly going to be talking about the El Paso border because that's where I'm from, and so that's what I know best. But this was a picture that kind of highlighted that, when I was growing up, this is kind of what the border looks like. So you can see that there's a fence, and then on the right-hand side is Juarez. The big X is a very iconic symbol for that city, and is something that is always kind of put in representation of Juarez. And so here you can kind of see very clearly, the X. I'm about to show you a video of somebody who's kind of driving along the same highway. And this video was taken much later after the wall was built, so May of 2022. And you can kind of see the difference in just how that wall looks. So you can see kind of as they're driving along, it's a much, much higher. There's more kind of distinction, and it's a lot more difficult to see through it compared to the fence that was there before. And you can actually see where the fence is. And so when it went up, there was a lot of talk about how, it literally physically makes it harder to see our neighbors. And so this was something that was really contested Anytime that there's been changes made to the border, it's been very contested. And these changes have been very recent. The kind of creation of fences, along the border really started in the 1990s, so not very long ago. And it wasn't until 2006 that this fence that we're seeing in this picture was even put up. And I remember in high school walking out from class with a lot of other people in protest of the building of this fence. Um, and so um, this idea of kind of living on the border and what that means and the creation of borders is something that has been part of my experience growing up. And so when I was there in December, was right when everything was happening with Title 42. There was a lot of uncertainty about whether that was going to be taken away. Title 42 was essentially allowing folks who were coming in for asylum to be able to come from specific areas, but was also preventing, because of COVID, generally pretty much everybody under this idea of a public health kind of emergency. And there was a lot of uncertainty about whether that was going to change and people were going to be allowed in, whether people were going to kind of have a lot of rules and things that were being put in place that was actually going to make it even harder to get in, and it would be even stricter. And there were already thousands of people who had been kind of coming to the border and had been waiting in lines for a very long time. And during the week that I was there, the weather had been dropping to some of the lowest temperatures that El Paso had ever seen. And so we kind of had this mass of people who were outside, um, you know, people who were both waiting on the other side of the border to have a chance to either be processed and have their case heard, um, or folks who had already either made their way across by finding a way over the fence or had been granted asylum, but then were just sort of released onto the street and then didn't have anywhere else to go, and ending up kind of mostly in the downtown area. And so everybody was trying to kind of navigate this weather. Um, and so these are pictures that were taken from that time. And so these are pretty much exactly kind of what I was seeing. Families sleeping out on the street. You had folks finding anywhere that they could between buildings. You can see along the area on the other side where kind of this big fence is, that you just had people who were lined up and waiting. And then there's both kind of this physical barrier of the river. But during that time, because of this storm, because of everything that was going on, El Paso was asking for humanitarian aid in order to be able to shelter more of the people that were there. And instead of sending humanitarian aid, the Texas governor sent the National Guard. And essentially, it just militarized the border even more. And so the National Guard came out, and they essentially started putting out all of this barbed wire to create even more borders between people and kind of where the Border Patrol folks were. And so this was something that you could see both in the media, but then also something that could be seen even just, walking around or even through kind of this giant fence. And so because of that, we wanted a chance to start thinking about the border, not only the border in terms of kind of the US-Mexico border and all of the things that are still happening there, which not only affects people from Mexico, but is affecting people from all of Latin America, and then also people from other countries who are also kind of coming through that same route. And then thinking about how that applies to us here, both personally and then, you know, within the context of the work that we're doing. So we're going to be using Mentimeter. And so if you're able to pull up a phone or a computer or anything, go to this website link, and it should pull you into an area that will give you access to these questions. And this is just to kind of help have us be able to have a discussion all together at once. I know there's quite a few of us on about what we think of when we hear the word border. And lots of us have different experiences with border and lots of different types of borders. And so this way we can kind of share what borders have meant in our life. And I will work on pulling it up so that way we can see in real time what people are actually sharing. And then feel free to answer in whatever language it is that you're speaking.
No se ve el Mentimeter. You have to move it to the center of your screen.
Yeah, I'm trying to pull it over.
If you can make it bigger. Ah.
So this will let you keep submitting as many times as you want. And we'll kind of let it go for a little bit. Kind of take notice of which things seem to be popping out. And so part of the way that this generally works is that the words that are getting put in the most are put in and are bigger. And so that this, you know, barrier and division are words that many people are saying. Separation, conflict, injusticia, that's another one. Now we also have things like sueños and hope and familia, I saw somewhere. Arms outstretched, crossed. Ability to see two worlds, but also pain, loss, and tragedy. Arbitrary, government imposed. Restriction, laws, politics, oppression, So I'll go ahead and stop it there, but we can see that even with just the few of us that are here, that there's a lot that comes up with thinking about the border, both things that can be very painful, things that can be tied to like injustice and oppression and fear. You know, a lot of folks were bringing up barrier and division and separation. And certainly within our most recent history, and we've talked about in other meetings about how that has personally impacted many of the folks within this group. We also can see areas of what people are bringing up in terms of hope and family and opportunities. A lot of those are reasons why people say that they come to the US, reasons why people might cross a border, but not even just crossing a physical border, but why people might cross any type of border. And so certainly a lot of different things that kind of come up. And definitely if we had more people here, we would come up with even more words, and with even more time, we would have probably a very large cloud, probably a storm. And so we'll come back to this in a bit. But there are many ways that borders can be defined, and people were sort of bringing it up in the chat. So some ways that people have defined borders has been politically. And so there are ways that we do this, both in terms of the language that we use when we're kind of having political debates. We have within kind of our government, people who are creating laws and regulations that shape what a border between our country looks like, not only between us and Mexico, but between the US and Canada. And so we can, sort of think about kind of that piece. And this is to say, right, that a lot of the time when we're talking about border from that sense, we're talking about something that is on land. We certainly have people crossing into what is considered the US through the air. And we don't have anything sort of marking things physically up there, but there are certainly ways that we mark kind of airspace as well. And along here, you can see that on this part, there isn't any fence. And in fact, on the US-Mexican border, there's almost 2,000 miles in total of the US-Mexican border, and only about 700 miles of it has any type of fence. Part of it has to do for environmental reasons, because there might be effects that might hurt the environment if a fence is built in certain areas. There are reasons that are kind of political, and the sense that there are wealthy landowners who have private land that this fence might cross on, and who don't want the fence built on their land, and so it hasn't been built there. And there are also areas where there is kind of terrain that people feel makes it already hard to get over. So would act already as a deterrent, and then the cost of building it. So all of those things can kind of define where the border is and what it looks like and how it operates and who enforces it. There's also economic borders. And so in this graph, what we're seeing here are wealth. And so the yellow dots are saying that each little yellow dot is 2 households that have a mean annual income that is less than $25,000 a year. And so the more deeply bright the yellow is, the more households in that area that have a mean annual income less than that. And then the blue dots are households, still 2 households per dot with an income greater than $200,000. So very wealthy households. And what we're seeing here in this kind of really bright blue space and then this really bright yellow space is essentially the Upper West Side of Manhattan and the Bronx in New York City. And so you can start to see kind of where that starts to play a role. Other ways are through language. It might be a little bit hard to see, but this is a map of India, and what it's mapping out is all of the different languages that are spoken in India. There's about 22 languages that are spoken there, and each of the different colors is a different language that is predominantly spoken in a region. And you can see that there is even kind of geographic separation between areas based on a lot of things, but that you can even define within that area a specific language that is being spoken. And then we talked about kind of physical and environments, and sometimes that kind of on its own creates borders. What we're looking at here is the Pyrenees Mountains, and the Pyrenees Mountains themselves separate France and Spain. And so it's not where the border is. So if you were to map out kind of where is the border between Spain and France, it would look a lot different. But physically, these mountains kind of serve as a kind of environmental border between those two countries. And then culturally, thinking about, different communities, there are ways in which that can create different types of borders, both in terms of kind of between different communities with different cultural backgrounds, but then also even within. Often when thinking about the borderlands, and certainly true to my experience, growing up, there was a lot that my friends and I would talk about as folks who were Mexican American. We always had this phrase, ni de aquí, ni de allá. And it's a lot about trying to figure out kind of where is your place between kind of being stuck almost like in that border space between two different cultures and not necessarily belonging to either. And so in many ways, borders are sort of not necessarily real things, but they become real, as we've seen through kind of all these examples, because we make them real. We make them real by making laws, by enforcing them. We make them real by creating groups, and the groups themselves over time kind of denote belonging. And so there are certain people who belong and certain people who don't. And those borders kind of delineate where it is exactly that happens. There's also ways in which the borders that we create can serve to further oppress certain people, and can be used as power. And traditionally, that's been the way that borders have been thought of, especially when talking about countries, that it's a way to sort of leverage power, and to have more and to be able to take more, in terms of land and resources and wealth. And borders can also be things that exist sort of even within ourselves, and within the ways that we think about ourselves, the ways that we think about our identities. And borders themselves, what we define as a specific place or a specific group, can create identities. It can create, an identity as what is an American, an identity as what does it mean to be from a certain country? What does it mean to be Latino? Which is something that we've kind of been talking about. And so all of that kind of impacts us. But the main thing I wanted to kind of drive through is that the ways that we define borders change all the time. And that this was something that I saw physically happening, and is something that I've grown to appreciate more over time. And the reason I kind of try to go back and to say, that they're not necessarily real and that we make them real, is to say that it's very easy to get caught up in how unchangeable and unsurmountable it can feel when a border exists. But when you kind of step back and you say, who creates a border? And you're able to kind of think and say, really it's us, we create the borders. And if we create the borders, then that means that we can change the borders. And so when we think about it this way, I think it gives us both an aspect of there's not an immovable object there, and that we are very powerful, and we have the ability to kind of define what those things are and to define if a border even exists. And so now, because a lot of our work has kind of mostly been around the health system and especially around COVID, we wanted to talk a little bit about what borders exist between the healthcare system and the Latino community. And so we're going to go back to the Mentimeter, and it should give you access to a second question.
You need to refresh it, Ree.
So definitely language is something that's coming up, something that's part of due to the system, culture, trust. insurance, time, technology, undocumented status, lack of knowledge around what services are available and how to access them. We have insurance and cost. Access to the internet. For preventative care. Lack of research. Working nonstop. A mountain to climb. Don't know where to go to find care, not having an email address.
For those who just joined us, I put the Menti where we are answering this question on the chat.
For those who just joined, when you go to this link, it'll give you access to be able to write in an answer in response to the question. And so really thinking about what borders exist between the healthcare system and the Latino community. The lack of providers that reflect the community. We have more things around fear and trust. Differences and distrust in terms of care from countries of origin versus the US. Stereotyping or not being taken seriously. Having different worldviews on healing and health. The Latino community being overlooked because there may not be funds to pay for services. There's certainly a lot of things that function to create borders between the healthcare system that exists and the community.